Welcome back, Wasteland Wanderers, to another deep dive into the darkest corners of Fallout lore. Today, we are exploring a conspiracy that makes Vault-Tec look almost merciful, the deep Earth colonies that were built by corporations who knew the bombs were coming and prepared to rule whatever remained after the fire. Let's descend into the darkness and discover the truth about the cities beneath the wasteland. In the absolute darkness 3 miles below Denver's ruins, something vast and impossible continues to thrive. A place where pre-war megacorporations spent fortunes creating underground metropolises that make Vault 111's stasis pods look like tourist attractions, and where I spent my first 30 years never seeing sunlight or knowing the bombs had already fallen. My name is Marcus Delano, and I was born in Sub-City Moloch on March 14th, 2108. That date means nothing to you surface dwellers, but to us, it marked the 31st anniversary of what you call the Great War. 31 years after nuclear fire consumed the world above, and I was crying my first breaths in a hospital 11.4 miles beneath what used to be the American Southwest, in a city that officially never existed. They say you can't miss what you've never known. My childhood proved that wrong every single day. I grew up in pressurized chambers where the atmosphere could crush a vault dweller's body into paste within seconds, where artificial lights mimicked the sun I'd only seen in holographic projections, where the word sky was as mythical to me as dragons or pre-war democracy. My teachers spoke of surface concepts like rain and wind, the way your people speak of alien worlds, theoretical and impossibly distant. I first learned about the real surface when I was 15 during my technical certification exams in Sector 99. The maintenance terminal I was supposed to be repairing had a corrupted memory core, fragments of old files bleeding through the system errors. Most were mundane requisition forms for pressure suits, geological surveys of bedrock composition, but one file dated July 11th, 2074, contained something that changed everything I thought I understood about my existence. It was a proposal document from something called the Prometheus Deep Earth Initiative. Not a memo, not a report, but a pitch, selling the idea of Sub-City Moloch to a consortium of corporations I'd never heard of, companies with names like Deep Reach Technologies and Subterranean Development Corporation. The language was clinical businesslike, discussing projected survival rates and optimal depth calculations for avoiding surface radiation detection. But one sentence burned itself into my memory. I can still recite it perfectly even now. Given current geopolitical trajectory analysis, probability of thermonuclear exchange exceeds 87% within the next 15 years. Deep Earth colonization represents humanity's best chance for uncontaminated survival and eventual surface reclamation. The date on that document was 2055, 22 years before the bombs fell. Someone knew, multiple someones. Entire corporations built our cities not to survive the war, but because they knew it was coming, knew when, and planned accordingly. I spent the next 3 months accessing every restricted database I could hack my way into, using my maintenance credentials to bypass security protocols that assumed no one in Moloch would even think to question our origins. What I found was a history that made Vault-Tec's experiments look almost merciful by comparison. The Prometheus Initiative began in 2055, exactly as that proposal indicated. But it wasn't a government project, not officially. It was pure corporate self-preservation funded by companies that had grown wealthy beyond measure during the resource wars and wanted to ensure their continuation regardless of what happened on the surface. The technology they developed was decades ahead of Vault-Tec's boring machines. Plasma drills capable of vaporizing granite at 50 feet per minute, creating shafts through solid bedrock that would have been impossible with conventional equipment. They called them thermal lance excavators, and they could bore through the Earth's crust like you might drill through soft wood. Construction of sub-city Moloch began in 2058 beneath what was then Colorado Springs, using techniques that the military-industrial complex had developed for deep bunker construction but never deployed at this scale. The initial dig went down 8 miles in the first 2 years. 8 miles of solid rock converted to a network of pressure-sealed chambers and tunnels, all built in absolute secrecy. The corporations funding the project Deep Reach Prometheus Industries Granite Shield Development. Others, whose names appeared in encrypted files, they weren't interested in preserving democracy or the American way of life. They wanted to preserve themselves, their wealth, their power. They wanted to survive the coming fire and emerge when the surface was ready for reclamation, ready to be claimed by whoever controlled the deepest, safest sanctuaries. By 2062, Moloch's first residential levels were operational. The corporate executives began moving their families below, slowly, quietly, taking positions in the growing underground infrastructure under the guise of overseeing a classified mining operation. The official cover story involved uranium extraction and weapons development, which wasn't entirely false. Moloch's lower levels housed fusion reactors that generated more power than most pre-war cities consumed enough electricity to keep our civilization running for millennia. If you're still with me after hearing this, hit that like and subscribe button, because what I'm about to tell you next reveals exactly how deep this conspiracy went and why people like me, born decades after the bombs fell, grew up thinking we were humanity's first deep Earth pioneers rather than the descendants of the rich and powerful who chose survival over warning anyone else. The full-scale evacuation happened in stages between 2074 and 2077. Corporate records I accessed showed meticulous planning, families selected based on genetic diversity requirements, technical skills, assessment, and most importantly, their ability to keep secrets. By October 20th, 2077, 3 days before the missiles launched, Sub-City Moloch housed 47,000 people across 23 completed levels. Not 47,000 desperate survivors scrambling for safety. 47,000 selected individuals who'd known for years exactly what was coming and when. My grandparents were among them. My grandfather, David Delano, worked for Deep Reach Technologies as a senior geologist. He helped select the bedrock formations stable enough to support cities at extreme depths. My grandmother, Sarah Chen, was a medical geneticist brought in to design the biological augmentation protocols that would allow humans to survive in 800 atmosphere pressure environments. They both knew for years before I was born. They both knew the world above would burn, and they said nothing. I found their personal logs in the archive 5 years ago. My grandmother's entry from September 15, 2077, just weeks before the war, described her daily routine with disturbing normalcy. Morning exercises in the Level 7 gymnasium, afternoon, gene therapy reviews, evening dinner with colleagues discussing optimal vitamin supplementation for children who would never see natural sunlight. Not a single word about the millions of people on the surface who had no idea what was coming, no concern for anyone outside the selected few deemed worthy of survival in the deep places. The other colonies, I learned about them gradually. Moloch wasn't alone. The corporations built 12 megacities scattered beneath the continental United States, each one housing between 30,000 and 300,000 people. Each one dug so deep that no surface radiation could possibly penetrate, so deep that most of the world above forgot we could even exist. Sub-City Tartarus beneath what used to be Nevada, Sub-City Erebus under Michigan, Sub-City Dis somewhere below Texas. The names alone told the story, mythological underworlds for a civilization that had literally descended into the Earth's bones to escape the consequences of their own greed. The cities were connected by maglev transit tunnels carved through bedrock at depths between 7 and 15 miles. High-speed trains capable of 500 miles per hour running through vacuum-sealed tubes that made the pre-war subway systems look like primitive joke. We could travel from Moloch to Tartarus in under 3 hours, crossing beneath devastated wasteland that we wouldn't even register as we passed under it at incredible speeds in perfectly climate-controlled comfort. Our society developed its own culture over the decades, beliefs and traditions that made sense only in the context of our strange existence. We worship the deep Mother Earth, a religion that emerged organically in the first generation, treating the rock itself as a protective deity that shielded us from the poison world above. We performed marriages in special chambers at the 12-mile depth, where the pressure was so intense that only the most heavily augmented individuals could survive without protective equipment. We had festivals celebrating the anniversary of first excavation, the day our founders broke through into what became Moloch's first chamber. Children grew up learning about surface dwellers as mythological creatures, beings adapted to impossibly low pressure and strange concepts like weather. I remember my fourth grade teacher, Instructor Morrison, describing rain as water falling from the sky and the entire class laughing because the idea seemed so absurd. Why would water fall from above when gravity pulls everything down? We understood physics perfectly, we just had no context for atmospheric phenomena that had never existed in our sealed, controlled environment. The genetic modifications we received at birth weren't optional. Every child born in Moloch underwent gene therapy within their first 72 hours of life, modifications that allowed our bodies to thrive in 800 atmosphere environments. Enhanced bone density to prevent crushing under extreme pressure. Cardiovascular adaptations that would make surface-level oxygen feel intoxicating and dangerous. Eyes modified to see in near-total darkness using infrared signatures from body heat. We were human technically, but a variant adapted for an environment no natural human could survive. I worked in the cultivation towers once I completed my technical certifications at age 18. Massive vertical farms reaching upward through 3 miles of excavated shafts growing protein-rich fungi that fed our entire population. The fungi were genetically engineered to thrive in high-pressure environments, producing nutrition profiles that kept us healthy without sunlight, without traditional crops, without any connection to the surface ecosystems that sustained humanity for millennia. Standing in those towers surrounded by endless rows of glowing mushroom cultivation beds, I felt the weight of our isolation more than anywhere else in Moloch. This was our world now. This was all we were. The Council of Depths governed all 12 colonies through a democratic process that seemed fair on the surface, but was carefully controlled by the descendants of the corporate elite who'd founded our cities. Voting rights required level 7 clearance or higher, which meant approximately 15% of Moloch's population actually participated in governance decisions. The rest of us, the maintenance workers, the farmers, the service personnel, we followed orders and trusted that our leaders understood the bigger picture. I learned about collection protocols when I achieved level 7 clearance at age 28. That's when they finally trusted me with the truth about our long-term purpose. The colonies weren't just survival shelters waiting for radiation levels to drop. We were preservation units designed to eventually reclaim and rebuild surface civilization. The corporations that built our cities planned for us to emerge after several generations when surface conditions stabilized enough for modified humans to survive with proper equipment. We would be the inheritors, the new rulers of whatever remained above. The collection protocols outlined exact procedures for surface expeditions beginning in the year 2150. Teams of pressure-adapted colonists would ascend gradually over 6 months, slowly adjusting to lower pressure environments through careful decompression. Once topside, they would gather survivors' technology, genetic samples, anything useful for accelerating our eventual dominance. The language in those protocols made it clear that we weren't coming up to help rebuild. We were coming up to claim what remained, to assert control over a weakened surface population using technology and resources they couldn't match. If you were born in a city built by people who knew the world would end and said nothing, could you ever trust that society's leadership? Or would you always wonder what else they're hiding from you? I started questioning everything after reading those protocols, the neat narrative they'd taught us since childhood that we were humanity's best hope for rebuilding civilization. It crumbled under the weight of what I now understood. We weren't saviors waiting to rescue a fallen world. We were colonizers preparing to exploit it. The distinction mattered more than I could have imagined. My doubts intensified when I met Archive Keeper Morrison during a routine maintenance call to the Central Archive on level 43. Morrison was ancient by our standards, 96 years old, which meant he'd been born in 2012, just 15 years before the Great War. He was among the last living people in Moloch who had memories of construction, who remembered the before times when our city was still being carved from bedrock by people who knew exactly what they were preparing for. Morrison caught me accessing geological survey data that predated Moloch's official construction timeline. I expected reprimand, possible security sanctions, maybe demotion back to lower clearance levels. Instead, he sealed the archive entrance and asked me a question that changed the trajectory of my entire life. How much do you actually know about the Deep Silent, Marcus? The Deep Silent. Everyone in Moloch knew the term areas between colonies where unexplained seismic activity occurred, where exploration teams sometimes disappeared without explanation, where communication through rock transmission simply ceased to function. Official explanations blamed geological instability, unpredictable fault lines, natural phenomena associated with extreme depths. But Morrison's expression suggested something else entirely, something that made the temperature in the archive feel several degrees colder despite our climate controls. He showed me seismic readings from between Moloch and Tartarus, a region approximately 200 miles of tunnel distance, where 3 separate exploration teams had vanished between 2090 and 2105. The readings showed patterns that made no geological sense, rhythmic vibrations at frequencies that suggested artificial generation rather than natural tectonic activity. Something down there, something in those spaces between our cities was producing signals that looked disturbingly like communication attempts. They never told the general population. Morrison explained, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, even though we were alone in a sealed chamber 11 miles underground. The council discovered it in 2088. There are structures in the Deep Silent, not natural formations. Structures built by something that was already down here when we started digging. I thought he'd lost his mind. 96 years old, probably experiencing the early stages of pressure dementia that affected some of the oldest colonists. But then he showed me the suppressed survey data images captured by deep scanning equipment that had been immediately classified above level 7 clearance. Geometric patterns in the bedrock, chambers that showed signs of excavation using techniques that predated human civilization by what the dating suggested was tens of thousands of years, possibly longer. The official story, the one taught to everyone in Moloch, claimed we were the first to dig this deep, the first to create permanent habitation at such extreme depths. That story was a lie. Something else had been down here first, something that built cities in the Earth's crust long before humans even discovered fire, and we had unknowingly dug our survival shelters right next to whatever they left behind. Morrison explained that the council's decision to suppress this information made a certain terrible logic. Our entire society was built on the premise of safe, controlled survival at depth, revealing that we shared the deep earth with unknown ancient structures, and possibly whatever created them would shatter that illusion of safety. People might demand evacuation to the surface, even knowing about the radiation. Panic could destabilize everything the colonies had built over generations. So they buried the truth under security classifications and continued expanding as if those discoveries had never happened. The exploration teams that vanished weren't lost to geological accidents. They'd gone into the Deep Silent regions, deliberately trying to map those ancient structures, trying to understand what we were dealing with. None of them ever returned. None of them ever transmitted any findings. The maglev tunnels connecting our cities were deliberately routed around those areas, adding hours to transit times to avoid passing near whatever existed in those forbidden depths. I spent weeks processing this information, barely sleeping, barely eating my mind, racing through implications that made my pressure-adapted headache. If we weren't alone down here, if something ancient and unknown existed in the same depths we called home, then everything about our supposed superiority and long-term survival became questionable. We were insects building colonies inside the walls of a house we didn't understand, congratulating ourselves on our architectural achievement while ignoring that we were guests, at best invaders at worst. My first surface expedition was scheduled for 6 months after my 30th birthday. Standard procedure for Level 7 personnel deemed suitable for collection protocol training. The preparation was brutal and tedious in equal measure. 6 months of gradual decompression, moving from Moloch's 800 atmosphere environment to progressively lower pressure chambers, allowing my body to slowly adjust to conditions that felt increasingly alien and uncomfortable. At 500 atmospheres, I started experiencing joint pain as my enhanced bone density began adapting. At 200 atmospheres, breathing became noticeably easier, but also strangely unsatisfying, like the air was too thin to properly nourish my lungs. By the time I reached standard vault depth pressure of approximately 1 atmosphere, I felt like I was floating, like gravity had reduced to a fraction of its proper strength. Every movement required conscious recalibration. I stumbled constantly, misjudging distances and forces in an environment my body had never been designed to operate within. The decompression team warned me that returning to depth would be equally challenging, that my body would need to readapt to high-pressure environments, even though I'd lived there for 30 years. Some colonists who spent extended periods on the surface never fully readjusted, developing what we called pressure separation syndrome, a condition where the body essentially forgot how to function properly at extreme depths. They lived out their lives in the upper staging areas between 3 and 5 miles down, unable to return home, but unwilling to remain on the irradiated surface. The surface expedition team consisted of 12 colonists, all level 7 or higher, all extensively briefed on collection protocols and authorized to use whatever means necessary to secure valuable resources or genetic material. Our mission was reconnaissance, primarily mapping the Denver ruins above Moloch's location, assessing current radiation levels, and cataloging any surviving technology that might prove useful for future colony operations. We ascended through a pressure lock system that would have made Vault-Tec engineers weep with envy. 47 separate chambers, each one gradually reducing atmospheric pressure, each transition taking hours to ensure our bodies adapted safely. The final chamber opened into what had once been a Department of Defense bunker built in 2071, now abandoned and partially collapsed from whatever destruction had occurred during the Great War. I saw sunlight for the first time at age 32. Real sunlight, not the simulated wavelength emissions from our artificial lighting systems. It was painful, blindingly intense, even through the protective filters in my pressure suit's visor. My eyes adapted for near total darkness, and infrared signatures couldn't properly process the sheer brightness of open sky. I had to close them for several minutes, letting tears stream down my face inside my helmet before I could squint upward and glimpse the impossible blue expanse above me. The ruins of Denver stretched in every direction, twisted metal and shattered concrete, testament to the nuclear fire that had consumed this place 131 years before I stood there. Radiation levels were still significant, approximately 40 rads per hour, according to our equipment, high enough to sicken an unprotected surface dweller within days. But for us, with our genetic modifications and pressure suits providing additional shielding, it was merely uncomfortable rather than immediately lethal. We spent 3 weeks exploring the ruins, cataloging pre-war technology that had somehow survived the blast and subsequent decay. I found a working holotape in what appeared to be a government office building dated October 20th, 2077. just 3 days before the bombs fell. The recording was a evacuation notice, calm and official, instructing federal employees to proceed to designated Vault-Tec shelters in an orderly fashion. No mention of the deep earth colonies. No hint that selected individuals had already been living safely 11 miles underground for years. Just the standard lies telling people they'd be safe in vaults that were actually designed as experimental torture chambers. That's when I met the ghoul. We were investigating a collapsed medical facility on our 8th day topside when movement in the shadows caught my attention. My first instinct was defensive raiders or hostile wildlife were constant concerns in the Wasteland. But the figure that emerged was something I'd only seen in archive photographs. A ghoul, skin leathered and partially decayed by radiation exposure, but clearly intelligent, clearly human in some fundamental way, despite the physical degradation. He called himself Thomas. Wouldn't give a last name, said he'd outlived the need for such formal identities. He'd been a doctor before the war, had survived the initial blast in a basement morgue of all places, and spent the last 131 years wandering the ruins of what used to be his city. When he saw me, saw my pressure suit's unusual design and the strange way I moved in the low-gravity environment, he asked a question that still haunts me. Are you even human anymore? I tried to explain, tried to describe Moloch and the other colonies, the genetic modifications that let us survive at crushing depths, the society we'd built in absolute darkness while the surface burned. He listened quietly, those radiation-ravaged eyes studying me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable even through layers of protective equipment. When I finished, he laughed. Not a cruel laugh, but something sad and resigned that made the sound echo strangely through the rubble around us. If this story has kept you listening this far and you want more of these dark confessions from the Wasteland, hit that like button. It really motivates me to create similar Fallout lores. You're the next step, Thomas said finally. You're what comes after us, after humanity as it was. You're adapted for a dead world, for living in places no natural human could go. You're survivors of a different kind. He paused, looking up at the sky, at the clouds drifting across that impossible blue expanse. We tried to survive by changing the world around us. You survived by changing yourselves. I'm not sure which approach is more human or if it even matters anymore. We spoke for several hours while my team continued their survey work nearby. Thomas told me about the days before the war, about a society so consumed by resource competition and political paranoia that nuclear annihilation seemed almost inevitable to anyone paying attention. He described watching the sky light up on October 23rd, 2077, knowing in that instant that everything he'd known was ending. He talked about the years immediately after the chaos and desperate violence as survivors fought over scraps, the slow realization that the vaults weren't salvation but experiments, the gradual decay of his own body as radiation transformed him into something other than what he'd been born as. Your people, he asked me toward the end of our conversation, they're planning to come back up eventually, aren't they? Not to help rebuild, to take over. It wasn't really a question. Somehow, this ghoul doctor who'd spent over a century in radioactive ruins understood the collection protocol's real intent better than most colonists who'd studied them. I confirmed his suspicion because lying seemed pointless. He nodded slowly, unsurprised, then offered me advice I didn't ask for but desperately needed. When you go back down to your city in the earth, ask yourself who you're really serving. The people who built Moloch, they weren't trying to save humanity. They were trying to save themselves and call it humanity. There's a difference. The return journey to Moloch took another 6 months of recompression, reversing the decompression process chamber by chamber, atmosphere by atmosphere. By the time I reached level 43 again, breathing the familiar super dense air of home, Thomas's question echoed in my mind with every pressure equalized breath. Are you even human anymore? Was I? Were any of us? We'd changed ourselves so fundamentally to survive that we'd become something new, something adapted for an environment no natural human was ever meant to inhabit. I submitted my expedition report to the council, as required clinical observations about radiation levels and salvageable technology. No mention of Thomas or the philosophical questions his existence raised. But privately, I began investigating aspects of Moloch's operations I'd never questioned before: the genetic modification programs, the collection protocol's true scope, the suppressed information about the deep silent and what might exist in those forbidden regions between our colonies. What I discovered over the following months painted a picture that made me physically ill despite my pressure-adapted constitution. The genetic modifications we received as infants weren't just about survival at depth. They were designed to create a superior human variant, stronger, more adaptable, capable of eventually dominating whatever surface populations survived the nuclear holocaust. The collection protocols weren't rescue missions, they were conquest plans. And the Council knew all of this, had known since the beginning, had built an entire society around the assumption that we would eventually emerge from the Earth to rule over a weakened, degraded surface humanity. We were never meant to be equals with surface dwellers. We were meant to be their replacements. If your entire society was designed around the idea of eventually conquering rather than helping survivors, could you stay loyal to that society? Or would you become a traitor to save people you'd never met? The breaking point came during a routine council meeting I attended as a newly promoted Level 8 technician. Level 8 clearance opened doors I'd never known existed, both literally and figuratively. I sat in chambers carved from bedrock at the 14-mile depth where only the most heavily modified colonists could survive without assistance, where the council conducted business they didn't want anyone else to witness. The agenda that day included discussing expansion plans for Sub-City Moloch, standard infrastructure topics, mostly boring administrative details about adding 3 new residential levels to accommodate our growing population. But then, Council Chairman Victor Strand raised what he called a sensitive matter requiring executive session. Everyone below Level 9 clearance was dismissed. I should have left. Instead, I hid in a maintenance crawl space I'd worked on months earlier, one with audio feeds that technically shouldn't have functioned but did if you knew how to bypass the security protocols. What I heard in that executive session destroyed any remaining illusions I'd held about Moloch's purpose and the people who governed it. Chairman Strand reported that the 2150 surface emergence timeline was being moved up, accelerated to 2130, just 22 years away instead of 42. The reason? Seismic analysis suggested that surface conditions had stabilized faster than original projections indicated. Radiation levels were dropping, ecosystems were slowly recovering, and most importantly, surface human populations were consolidating into vulnerable settlements that would be easy to control with superior technology. Council member Zhang questioned the accelerated timeline not out of moral concern but purely tactical calculation. Our forces won't be fully prepared by 2130, she argued. The combat augmentation programs need at least another generation to produce soldiers capable of sustained surface operations. Forces, combat augmentation, soldiers, they weren't even pretending anymore, at least not in private. Strand dismissed her concerns with casual confidence that made my blood run cold even in the superheated depths. We don't need military superiority, he explained. We need technological and biological superiority. Surface dwellers have adapted to radiation and scarcity. We've adapted to conditions that would kill them in seconds. We offer them clean water, fusion power, medical treatments they can't replicate. They'll submit willingly to gain access to what we provide. The ones who resist. He paused, and I could hear the smile in his voice even through the audio feed. Well, the collection protocols include contingencies for resistance management. The discussion continued for 2 hours. I listened to people I'd respected, leaders I'd trusted, calmly planning the systematic subjugation of surface humanity. They discussed genetic screening programs to identify surface dwellers with desirable traits for breeding into the colony population. They debated whether to allow surface settlements any autonomy or implement direct colonial governance. They actually argued about how much knowledge to share versus how much to withhold to maintain technological supremacy. Council member Reeves raised the question of the deep silent, asking if the ancient structures posed any threat to their plans. Strand acknowledged they remained a concern, but insisted that avoiding those regions had proven effective so far. Whatever built those structures, he said, if it still exists, it hasn't shown interest in us. We maintain the exclusion zones, continue routing around the affected areas, and proceed with surface operations as planned. The deep silent is a mystery, but not an immediate obstacle to our objectives. That casual dismissal of something that had terrified Morrison, that had consumed exploration teams without explanation, revealed how arrogant the council had become. They'd lived 11 miles underground for over a century, convinced their technology and genetic superiority made them invincible. They'd forgotten, or maybe never understood, that humanity's greatest weakness has always been assuming we're the apex predator in any given environment. I spent the next week in a state of barely controlled panic, going through the motions of my technical duties while my mind raced through impossible choices. I could report what I'd heard, but to whom? The council controlled every aspect of Moloch's government and security. I could try to warn surface dwellers about what was coming, but I had no way to contact them from 11 miles down, and even if I could reach them, why would they trust someone from a deep Earth colony they didn't know existed? The answer came from an unexpected source. Morrison contacted me through a encrypted message drop we'd established after our first conversation about the deep silent. He had information he claimed that I needed to see immediately. We met in the archive again, and this time, he showed me something that made the council's surface conquest plans seem almost mundane by comparison. He'd been investigating the ancient structures in the deep silent for 40 years, using his position as archive keeper to access suppressed research data and compile information that the council had deliberately fragmented across different security classifications. What he'd discovered was a pattern. The structures weren't random. They formed a network, a massive interconnected system that stretched beneath the entire North American continent at depths ranging from 10 to 20 miles. And our colonies, all 12 of them, were built directly on top of major nodes in that network. It's not a coincidence, Morrison explained, spreading seismic survey maps across the archive's central table. The corporations that built our cities, they knew about these structures before they started digging. They chose these locations specifically because of what was already here. He tapped one of the maps highlighting Moloch's position. Look at the geothermal readings. Our power systems tap into thermal vents that shouldn't exist at this depth, not with this output. The heat we've been harvesting for fusion power, it's not natural. It's generated by something in those ancient structures. I stared at the maps, seeing patterns I'd never noticed before, despite years of working with similar geological data. The thermal vents we relied on for power all originated from areas designated as deep silent exclusion zones. The maglev tunnels connecting our cities followed routes that wove between larger structural formations like threads through a fabric we couldn't fully perceive. We hadn't built an independent deep Earth civilization. We'd built a parasite network feeding off something that already existed, something incomprehensibly older and more advanced than anything human technology had achieved. The council knows. Morrison continued, his voice heavy with exhaustion and anger accumulated over decades. They've always known. The corporate founders discovered these structures during initial surveys in 2056. That's why they were so confident about long-term survival at extreme depths. They weren't pioneering new territory. They were moving into an existing infrastructure and hoping whatever built it wouldn't notice or care. The implications cascaded through my mind like a pressure breach. each realization triggering the next in a chain reaction I couldn't stop. If the council knew we were dependent on ancient systems we didn't understand, that explained their obsession with surface conquest. They needed alternative resources and territory before whatever existed in the deep silent decided to reclaim its property. The accelerated timeline for surface emergence wasn't about opportunity. It was about escape, getting enough of our population topside to ensure species survival before something in the depths below our deepest cities decided we'd overstayed our welcome. There's more, Morrison said, and I genuinely didn't know how there could possibly be more. He activated a holographic display showing seismic data from the past 6 months. The deep silent is getting louder. Those rhythmic vibrations I showed you before, they're increasing in frequency and intensity. It started about a year ago, subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice. But I've been monitoring these signals for 4 decades. Something down there is waking up or activating or responding to our presence, and it's accelerating. The data showed what he described: seismic pulses emanating from deep silent regions at regular intervals, growing stronger with each passing month. The pattern looked almost biological, like a heartbeat steadily increasing its rhythm. In the region between Moloch and Tartarus, where 3 exploration teams had vanished, the pulse frequency had tripled in just the last 6 months. The council is trying to evacuate key personnel and resources to the surface before it's too late, Morrison explained. That's the real reason for the accelerated timeline. They think they can strip our cities of valuable technology and genetic material, establish themselves topside with overwhelming advantages, and leave the rest of us down here to deal with whatever happens when those structures fully activate. I asked the question that seemed most relevant in that moment of revelation. Why are you telling me this? Why not expose it yourself? You've got the data, the clearance, the credibility. Morrison's laugh was bitter and tired. I'm 96 years old, Marcus. I've got maybe 5 years left, probably less. The council knows I've been investigating. They just consider me a harmless obsessive who'll die before he can do anything meaningful with what he's found. But you're young, pressure adapted. You've been topside and survived. You have connections to maintenance systems throughout Moloch. You could actually do something with this information. What he was suggesting was treason, pure and simple. Exposing the council's plans, revealing the truth about the deep, silent warning, both surface dwellers and common colonists about what was really happening. It would destabilize everything. It might trigger panic evacuations that could kill thousands as people tried to reach the surface without proper decompression. It might cause civil war within the colonies as factions formed around different interpretations of the truth. It would certainly make me the most wanted criminal in Moloch's history. I asked Morrison what he would do in my position. He thought about it for a long moment, then gave me an answer that was somehow both unhelpful and perfectly clear. I'd do what you think is right, not what you think is safe. We've been safe for over a century down here, Marcus. Safe and ignorant and complicit in plans we never questioned. Maybe it's time to choose being right over being safe. If you discovered your entire civilization was built on stolen infrastructure from an unknown ancient species that might be waking up, would you warn everyone, even if it caused chaos? Or keep quiet to maintain order? I spent 3 days considering my options, barely sleeping, barely eating, running scenarios through my mind that all ended badly in different ways. On the 4th day, I made my decision. I would warn them, all of them. Surface dwellers, common colonists, everyone who deserved to know the truth about what the council had built and what was coming. And I would start by going back to the one place where I might find allies who understood the stakes. I requested another surface expedition, citing the need to verify some technical findings from my first trip. My level 8 clearance made the request routine approved within hours. The decompression cycle began immediately, 6 months of gradual pressure reduction, while I used the time to compile every piece of evidence. Morrison had given me every suppressed report about the deep silent, every document revealing the council's true intentions for surface populations. I encrypted the data using techniques I'd learned from bypassing maintenance security protocols, hiding it in seemingly mundane geological survey files that wouldn't trigger security reviews. By the time I reached final decompression and prepared for surface transit, I had a complete archive of Moloch's secrets compressed into data formats that could be transmitted using pre-war communications equipment if I could find any that still functioned. The second surface expedition was smaller, just 6 colonists instead of 12. We emerged through the same Department of Defense bunker into the same blinding sunlight and impossible sky. But this time, I knew what I was looking for. I needed to find Thomas, the ghoul doctor, or someone like him, someone who could help me understand surface settlements and political structures. Someone who could help me warn people about what was coming in 22 years when Moloch's forces emerged to claim dominion over whatever humanity remained. I found him 3 days into the expedition, or rather, he found me appearing from the rubble of what used to be a shopping district with that same unsettling ability to materialize from shadows. "Back already?" he asked, something knowing in his radiation-ravaged eyes. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon, Deep Dweller. Something changed down there in your buried city?" Everything had changed, and I was about to trust a ghoul I barely knew with information that could rewrite the future of both our peoples if we had the courage to act on it and the luck to survive what came next. I told Thomas everything. We sat in the ruins of what had once been a public library surrounded by scattered books whose pages had long since degraded to radioactive pulp, and I explained the entire conspiracy. The deep Earth colonies built by corporations who knew the war was coming. The genetic modifications designed to create a superior human variant. The collection protocols that were really conquest plans. The ancient structures in the deep silent that our cities were parasitically feeding off. The accelerating seismic pulses suggesting something vast and incomprehensible was waking up 11 miles below the surface. He listened without interrupting those ghoul eyes, never leaving my face even through my pressure suit's visor. When I finished, he was quiet for so long I thought maybe he'd dismiss the whole thing as the ravings of someone who'd spent too long at crushing depths. Then he spoke, and his words carried the weight of someone who'd survived impossible things and learned to trust his instincts about what threatened survival. "I believe you," Thomas said simply. "Not because I understand the technology or the politics, but because I've seen what happens when powerful people decide they're better than everyone else and deserve to rule. That's what started the resource wars. That's what led to the bombs. And now you're telling me it's about to happen again? Except this time the conquerors will be genetically engineered deep Earth dwellers instead of pre-war governments." He paused, looking up at the partially collapsed ceiling above us. "History doesn't repeat, but it sure as hell rhymes." He knew people, Thomas explained, survivors who'd formed settlements across the Wasteland communities that had clawed their way back from the edge of extinction through cooperation and adaptation. Not the raiders or slavers, but actual societies trying to rebuild something resembling civilization. Diamond City up in Boston, the hub in Old California. Smaller settlements scattered across the continent, all of them vulnerable to the kind of technological and biological superiority Moloch could bring to bear. "They need to know," Thomas said. "They need time to prepare to build defenses, to maybe form alliances. 22 years sounds like forever, but it's not. Not when you're talking about coordinating across a broken continent with limited communication." He studied me carefully. "But you already knew that. That's why you came looking for me. You need someone who knows the surface, who can help spread the word without causing the kind of panic that'll get everyone killed." I confirmed his assessment. Alone, I could maybe warn 1 or 2 settlements before Moloch's security forces tracked me down and dragged me back to face execution for treason. But with help from someone embedded in surface survivor networks, someone who understood Wasteland politics and could frame the warning in ways that would be taken seriously rather than dismissed as paranoid fantasy, we might actually give people a fighting chance. Over the next 2 weeks, while my official expedition team surveyed ruins and collected salvage, Thomas and I developed a plan. I would return to Moloch as scheduled, maintain my cover, and continue feeding information to surface contacts through coded transmissions disguised as geological survey data. Thomas would begin the slow process of contacting settlements, sharing what I'd revealed, building a coalition of surface communities willing to prepare for the threat that would emerge from deep Earth in 2 decades. It was a desperate plan with 1,000 ways to fail. The Council monitored all communications between colonies and surface. Security protocols flagged unusual data patterns. My clearance level meant I was watched more closely than lower-tier workers. One mistake, one suspicious transmission, one security review that noticed anomalies in my geological reports, and everything would collapse. I would disappear into Moloch's detention levels, and surface communities would remain ignorant until conquest forces emerged from the Earth fully prepared for domination. But the alternative was accepting complicity in the subjugation of whatever remained of free humanity. It was letting the Council's plan proceed unopposed, letting them strip our colonies of resources while abandoning common colonists to face whatever awakened in the deep silent. It was being safe instead of being right, and I'd already made my choice about which mattered more. The return to Moloch was harder than I'd anticipated, and not just because of the recompression process. Every chamber I passed through on the descent felt more like a prison than home. Every familiar face I saw belonged to someone who either didn't know they were living in a parasitic city built on stolen infrastructure, or worse, did know and had accepted it as the price of survival. By the time I reached level 43 and breathed the familiar super dense air that should have felt comforting, all I felt was a crushing sense of being trapped. Morrison was waiting in the archive when I reported back for duty. He didn't ask directly about my surface activities, but his knowing look suggested he understood I'd taken action. "The seismic activity increased again while you were gone," he said quietly, pulling up the latest data. "The pulses are now occurring every 6 hours instead of every 12. Whatever's down there, it's definitely responding to something. Maybe our power extraction, maybe just our presence, but it's building towards something, Marcus. Something big." The data supported his assessment. All 12 colonies were reporting similar increases in deep silent activity. The region between Moloch and Tartarus, always the most active, now showed seismic signatures that looked almost like language complex patterns of vibration that repeated with variations, suggesting intentional communication rather than random geological phenomena. The Council had quietly evacuated the maglev tunnel through that region, rerouting all intercolony traffic through longer alternative paths. "How long do we have?" I asked, studying the accelerating pattern. Morrison shook his head. "No way to know for certain. Could be months, could be years. But based on the rate of increase, I'd estimate we have 5 years, maybe 10 at most, before whatever's generating these signals reaches a threshold we can't ignore or avoid." He met my eyes directly. "The Council knows this. That's why they're desperately accelerating the surface timeline. They're not planning to evacuate everyone, Marcus. They're planning to save themselves and the genetic material they consider valuable, and leave the rest of the colony population to whatever happens when those ancient systems fully activate. 5 to 10 years before the Deep Silent reached some kind of critical threshold, 22 years before the Council planned to emerge topside for conquest. The timelines didn't align, which meant the Council was lying about their real schedule. They were probably planning to evacuate key personnel much sooner, maybe within the next few years, establishing surface positions while claiming it was just advanced reconnaissance. I spent the next 3 years walking a razor's edge between maintaining my cover and feeding information to surface contacts through Thomas. The data I transmitted was carefully designed to look like routine geological surveys, but encoded within the measurements and technical specifications were details about Moloch's capabilities, the Council's plans, the accelerating deep silent activity, everything surface communities would need to prepare adequate defenses or at least understand what they were facing. Thomas proved remarkably effective at spreading the word without triggering mass panic. He framed the warning not as an imminent threat, but as intelligence about a long-term danger requiring preparation and cooperation. Settlements began quietly, forming defensive alliances, sharing technology and resources, building communication networks that could coordinate response to threats emerging from unexpected directions. They didn't know exactly when or where deep Earth forces would surface, but they knew it was coming, and they knew they needed to be ready. The Council noticed the increased cooperation among surface settlements. Security briefings I attended through my Level 8 clearance discussed the unexpected organization surface dwellers were showing, speculating about leadership and coordination that shouldn't exist among scattered survivor communities. They attributed it to natural evolution of wasteland politics, never suspecting that one of their own mid-level technicians was actively arming their future enemies with strategic intelligence. In my 4th year back, Morrison died. Pressure dementia finally claimed him, his mind fragmenting under the weight of decades at extreme depths and the stress of knowing terrible truths he could share with so few people. I found him in the archive one morning, collapsed at his desk, surrounded by maps of the deep silent. His last entry in his personal log was a simple statement that hit harder than any lengthy confession could have. I did what I could with what I had. Now it's up to those who come after to finish what we started. May they have the courage we lacked for too long. His death meant I lost my primary ally within Moloch, but it also meant I inherited his complete archive of suppressed research. As the senior technician assigned to catalog his files, I had legitimate access to everything he'd compiled over 40 years. I spent 6 months carefully copying the most damaging evidence, encrypting it, and transmitting it to Thomas through increasingly sophisticated coding methods that pushed the limits of what I could hide within geological data. The deep silent continued its acceleration. By year 5, the pulses were occurring every 2 hours. Entire sections of Lower Moloch had been quietly evacuated due to structural instability caused by the intensifying seismic activity. The Council announced it as routine maintenance, but anyone with access to the real data knew we were experiencing resonance effects from whatever existed in those ancient structures. Our cities were vibrating in sympathy with something incomprehensibly larger, like tuning forks, responding to a signal we couldn't consciously hear. Council Chairman Strand died in year 6, officially from pressure-related cardiac failure, though rumors whispered about assassination by factions who opposed his aggressive surface conquest timeline. His replacement council member Zhang proved even more ruthless. She accelerated preparations for surface operations, authorizing genetic experiments to create combat-optimized variants specifically designed for sustained surface deployment. The collection protocols were updated to explicitly include population control measures and technological suppression strategies. I was promoted to Level 9 clearance in year 7, a development that terrified me more than pleased me. Level 9 meant access to executive planning sessions, direct involvement in surface operation preparations, and most dangerously, increased security scrutiny. Every communication I sent was reviewed. Every movement I made was tracked. I could no longer safely transmit information to Thomas without risking discovery, but I'd already transmitted enough. 7 years of steady intelligence sharing had given surface settlements a comprehensive understanding of what they faced and significant time to prepare. They'd built defensive networks, stockpiled weapons, developed counter-technologies based on my descriptions of Moloch's capabilities. They weren't defenseless anymore. They had a chance which was more than they'd had when I started this desperate gambit. The final crisis came during a Level 9 briefing in Year 8. Council member Zhang announced that the first wave of surface deployment would begin in 6 months, not the publicly stated 14 years. 50,000 colonists, all genetically optimized for combat and conquest, would emerge at 12 strategic locations across North America. Their mission was to establish control over major settlements, secure critical resources, and prepare the way for full-scale colonial emergence. If you had to choose between your own people and doing what's right, even knowing you'd be branded a traitor forever, which would you choose? Is loyalty to your society more important than loyalty to humanity itself? I made my choice in that briefing room 11 miles beneath the Earth's surface. I would go topside one final time, not as a scout or spy, but as a defector. I would bring with me everything I knew about the deployment timeline, the strategic locations, the force composition, and I would spend whatever time remained before the first wave emerged, helping surface communities prepare for the fight of their lives. The decompression cycle for my final ascent took 6 months, and I used every moment to copy additional data to compile comprehensive intelligence packages to prepare for a life on the surface I'd never been designed to survive long term. My pressure-adapted body would always struggle in low-atmosphere environments. My radiation resistance was minimal compared to ghouls or naturally adapted surface dwellers. I would be giving up everything familiar, everyone I'd known, the only home I'd ever had. But when I emerged through that Department of Defense bunker for the third and final time, when I saw Thomas waiting for me in the ruins of Denver with representatives from 6 different settlements, when I handed over data chips containing everything Moloch wanted to keep secret, I felt something I'd never experienced in 11 miles of pressurized chambers and artificial light. I felt free. The war is coming. In approximately 6 years from when I'm recording this confession, deep Earth forces will emerge at strategic points across the wasteland. They'll offer clean water and fusion power and medical miracles. They'll seem like saviors to desperate communities, but they're conquerors wearing the mask of benefactors, and everything they offer comes with chains attached. Surface settlements know now. They're preparing. They have intelligence about deployment locations, force compositions, technological capabilities. It won't be an easy fight, might not even be a winnable fight, but at least it'll be a fight instead of a capitulation. As for me, I'm somewhere in the wasteland now, working with communities I was supposed to subjugate, helping them prepare defenses against my own people. The council has branded me a traitor. There's a standing execution order if I'm ever captured. I can never go home, never breathe that familiar super dense air, never see the cultivation towers where I spent my youth. But I sleep better in a radiation-contaminated tent under an impossible sky than I ever did 11 miles down in absolute safety, because I know that whatever happens when those deep Earth forces emerge, whatever catastrophe unfolds, when the ancient systems in the deep silent finally complete their activation, I did everything I could to give people a choice about their future, instead of accepting someone else's vision of domination. If this confession meant something to you, leave a like. It's the only way I know you liked the video. The Earth has secrets in its depths that humanity never imagined. We thought we were so clever digging down to escape our own destruction, building cities in the bones of the world. But we were just children playing in ruins we didn't understand, and now we're all going to pay the price for that arrogant surface and deep dwellers alike. I just hope that when that payment comes due, enough of us remember that we're all human regardless of what genetic modifications or radiation exposure has changed about our bodies. Because if we can't remember that, if we let differences divide us when something ancient and incomprehensible rises from the true depths below even our deepest cities, then maybe we deserve whatever comes next. My name is Marcus Delano. I was born in Sub-City Moloch, 11.4 miles beneath the surface, and I chose the wasteland sky over the crushing depths of home because being right mattered more than being safe. Now I live with that choice, and whatever comes next, I'll face it standing under impossible stars rather than kneeling in the comfortable darkness below.